Transylvania, the first week of September 1981. Still an hour short of midday, two peasant wives of Halmagiu village wended their way home along well-trodden forest tracks. Their baskets were full of small wild plums and the first ripe berries of the season, all with the dew still glistening on them. Some of the plums were still a little green, all the better for the making of sharp, tangy brandy, dark-robed with coarse cloth head squares framing their narrow faces. The women cheerfully embroidered tidbits of village gossip to suit their mood, their teeth flashing ivory and weathered leather as they laughed over especially juicy morsels. In the near distance, blue wood smoke drifted in almost perpendicular spirals from Halmagiu's chimneys. It formed a haze high over the early autumn canopy of forest. But closer, in among the trees themselves, were other fires. Cooking smells of spiced meats and herbal soups drifted on the still air. Small silver bells jingled. A bough creaked where a wild-haired, dark-eyed, silent, staring child dangled from the rope of a makeshift swing. There were gaudy caravans gathered in a circle under the trees. Outside the circle, tethered ponies cropped the grass, and bright-colored dresses swirled where bare-armed girls gathered firewood. Inside, black iron cooking pots suspended over licking flames issued puffs of mouth-watering steam. Male travelers tended their own duties or simply looked on, smoking their long, thin-stemmed pipes as the encampment settled in. Travelers, yes. Wanderers, gypsies. The Scani had returned to the region of Halmagiu. The boy on the rope in the tree had spotted the two village women and now uttered a piercing whistle. All murmur and jingle and movement in the gypsy encampment ceased upon the instant. Dark eyes turned outwards in unison, staring with curiosity at the Romanian peasant women with their baskets. The gypsy men in their leather jackets looked very strong, somehow fierce, but there was nothing of animosity in their eyes. They had their own codes, the Sagani, and knew which side their bread was greased. For 500 years, the people of Halmagiu had dealt with them fairly, bought their trinkets and knickknacks and left them in peace. And so, in their turn, the gypsies would work no deliberate harm against Halmagiu. "Good morning, ladies." The gypsy king, for so the leaders of these roving bands prided themselves as little kings, stood up on the steps of his wagon and bowed to them. "Please tell our friends in the village we'll be knocking on their doors. Pots and pans of the best quality. Charms to keep away the night things. Cards to read and keen eyes that know the lie of a line in your palm. Bring out your knives for sharpening and your broken axe handles. All will be put to rights. Why, this year we've even a good pony or two to replace the nags that pull your carts. We'll not be here long, so make the best of our bargains before we move on." "Good morning to you," the oldest of the pair at once answered, if in a breathless fashion. "And be sure I'll tell them in the village." And in a hushed aside to her companion, "Stay close. Move along with me. Say nothing." As they passed by one of the wagons, so this same older woman took a small jar of hazelnuts from her basket and a double handful of plums, placing them on the steps of the wagon as a gift. If the offering was seen, no one said anything, and in any case the activity in the camp had already resumed its normal pace as the women headed once more for home. But the younger one, who hadn't lived in Halmagiu very long, asked, "Why did you give the nuts and plums away? I've heard the gypsies give nothing for nothing, do nothing for nothing, and far too often take something for nothing. Won't it encourage them, leaving gifts like that?" "It does no harm to keep well in with the Fey people," the other told her. "When you've lived here as long as I have, you'll know what I mean. And anyway, they're not here to steal or work mischief." She gave a small shudder. "Indeed, I fancy I know well enough why they're here." "Oh?" said her friend wonderingly. "Oh yes, it's the phase of the moon. A calling they've heard, an offering they'll make. They propitiate the earth, replenish the rich soil, appease their gods." "Their gods? Are they heathens then?" "What gods?" "Call it nature if you like 'em," the first one snapped. "But ask me no more. I'm a simple woman and don't wish to know. Nor should you wish to know. My grandmother's grandmother remembered a time when the gypsies came. Aye, and likely her granny before her. Sometimes 15 months will go by, or 18, but never more than 21, before they're back again. Spring, summer, winter. Only the Scani themselves know the season, the month, the time. But when they hear the calling, when the moon is right, When a lone wolf howls high up in the mountains, then they return. Yes, and when they go, they always leave their offering. What sort of offering? The younger woman was more curious than ever. Don't ask, said the other, hurriedly shaking her head. Don't ask. But it was only her way. The younger woman knew she was dying to tell her. She bided her time and resolved to ask no more. But in a little while, fancying that they'd strayed too far from the most direct route back to the village, she felt obliged to inquire, "But isn't this a long way round we're taking?" "Be quiet now," hushed the older woman. "Look!" They had arrived at a clearing in the forest at the foot of a gaunt outcrop of gray volcanic rock. Bald and domed with several humps, this irregular mound stood perhaps 50 feet high, with more forest beyond than sheer cliffs rising to a fir-clad plateau, like a first gigantic step to the misted, grimly forbidding heights of the Zarandului Massif. The trees around the base of the outcrop had been felled, all shrubs and undergrowth cleared away. At its summit, a cairn of heavy stones stood like a small tower or chimney, pointing to the mountains. And up there, seated on the bare rock at the foot of the cairn, working with a knife at a shard of stone which he held in his lap, a young man, scrawny. He was intent upon his work, seeing nothing but the stone in his hands. He gazed down across a distance of little more than 100 feet, gazed seemingly head-on, so that the women of the village must surely be central to his circle of vision. But if he saw them, he gave no sign, and indeed it was plain that he did not see them, only the stone which he worked. And even at that distance, clearly there was something not quite right with him. "But what's he doing up there?" the younger of the two inquired in a hoarse whisper. "He's very handsome, and yet strange. And anyway, isn't this a forbidden place? My Hazak tells me that the great stone of the cairn is a very special stone, and that—" "Shh," the other once again cautioned her, a finger to her lips. "Don't disturb him. They don't take kindly to being spied upon, this Scani. Not that this one will hear us anyway. Still, best to be careful." "He won't hear us, you say? Then why are we talking in whispers?" "No, I know why we're whispering. Because this is a private place, like a shrine. Almost holy." "Unholy," the other corrected her. "As to why he won't notice us, why, just look at him up there. His skin's not so much dark as slate gray, sickly, dying, eyes deep sunken, burning, obsessed with that stone he's carving. He's been called, can't you see? He's mazed, hypnotized, doomed." Even as the last word left her lips, so the man on the rock stood up, took up his stone and ground it firmly into position on the rim of the cairn. It sat there side by side with many dozens of others, like a brick in the topmost tier of a wall. And anyone having seen the ritual of the carving would know that each single stone of that cairn was marked in some weird, meaningful way. The younger woman opened her mouth to say something, but her friend at once anticipated her question. "His name," she said. "He carved his name and his dates if he knows them. Like all the other names and dates carved up there. Like all the others gone before him. That rude stone is his headstone, which makes the cairn itself a graveyard." Now the young gypsy was craning his neck, looking up at the mountains. He stood frozen in that position for long moments, as if waiting for something. And high in the gray-blue sky, a small, dark blot of cloud drifted across the face of the sun. At that, the eldest of the two women gave a start. She herself had become almost hypnotized, stalled there and without the will to move on. But as the sun was eclipsed and shadows fell everywhere, she grabbed the other's elbow and turned her face away. "Come!" she gasped, suddenly breathless. "Let's be gone from here. Our men will be worried, especially if they know there are gypsies about." They hurried through the shadows of the trees, found the track, soon began to see the first wooden houses on Halmagu's outskirts, where the forest thinned down to nothing. But even as they stepped out from the trees into a dusty lane and their heartbeats slowed a little, so they heard a sound from behind and above and far, far beyond. Not quite midday in Halmagu, the sun coming out from behind a small stray cloud. The first days of true winter, still some 7 or 8 weeks away, but every soul who heard that sound took it as a wintry omen anyway. Aye, and some took it for more than that. It was the mournful voice of a wolf echoing down from the mountains, calling as wolves have called for 1,000 years and more. The two women paused, clutched their baskets, held their breath, and listened. But there's no answering cry, said the younger eventually. He's alone, that old wolf. For now, the other nodded. Aye, alone. But he's been heard all right, take my word for it. And he will be answered soon enough. Following which, she shook her head and hurried on. The other caught up with her. Yes, following which, she pressed. The older woman peered at her, scowled a little, finally barked, but you must learn to listen, Anna. There are some things we don't much talk about up here, so if you want to learn them when they are talked about, you must listen. I was listening, the other answered. It's just that I didn't understand, that's all. You said the old wolf would be answered soon enough, and then, aye, and then, said the older one, turning towards her doorway, where bunches of garlic dangled from the lintel, drying in the sun, and over her shoulder. And then, the very next morning, why, the Sugani will be gone. No trace of them at all, except maybe the ashes in their camp, the ruts in the tracks where their caravans have rolled, moving on. But their numbers will have been shortened by one who answered an ancient call and stayed behind. The younger woman's mouth formed a silent "oh." That's right, said the first, nodding. You just saw him adding his soul to those other poor souls inscribed in the cairn on the rock. That night in the Sugani camp, the girls danced, whirling to the skirl of frenzied violins and the primal thump and jingle of tambourines. A long table stood heavy with food, joints of rabbit and whole hedgehogs, still steaming from the heat of the trenches where they'd baked, wild boar sausages, sliced thin, cheeses purchased or bartered in Hamaju village, fruit and nuts, onions simmering in gravy poured from the meats, gypsy wines and sharp, throat-clutching wild plum brandy. There was a festival atmosphere. The flames of a central fire, inspired by the music, leaped high and the dancers were sensuous. Alcohol was consumed in large measure. Some of the younger gypsies drank from a sense of relief, others from fear of an uncertain future. For those who had been spared this time around, there would always be other times. But they were Sugani, and this was the way of things. They were his to the ends of the earth, his to command, his to take. Their pact with the Old One had been signed and sealed more than 400 years ago. Through him, they had prospered down the centuries. They prospered now, they would prosper in all the years to come. He made the hard times easier, and the easy times hard, but always he achieved a balance. His blood was in them and theirs in him, and the blood is the life. Only two amongst them were alone in private. Even with the girls dancing, the drinking, the feasting, still they were alone. For all of this noise and movement around them was an assumed gaiety wherein they could scarcely participate. One of them, the young man from the cairn, sat on the steps of an ornately carved and painted wagon, with a whetstone and his long-bladed knife, bringing the cutting edge to a scintillant shimmer of silver in the flicker of near-distant firelight. While in the yellow lamplight behind him where the door stood open, his mother sat sobbing, wringing her hands, praying for all she was worth to one who was not a god, indeed to one who was the very opposite, that he spare her son this night. But praying in vain, and as one tune ended and bright skirts whispered to a halt, falling about gleaming brown limbs, and mustached men quit their leaping and high kicking, in that interval when the fiddlers sipped their brandy before starting up again, then the moon showed its rim above the mountains, whose misted crags were brought to a sudden prominence. And as mouths gaped open and all eyes turned upwards to the risen moon, so the mournful howl of a wolf drifted down to them from unseen areas of rock. For a single moment the tableau stood frozen, but the next saw dark eyes turning to gaze at the young man on the caravan steps. He stood up, looked up at the moon and the crags, and sighed. And sheathing his knife, he stepped down to the clearing, crossed it on stiff legs, headed for the darkness beyond the encircling wagons. His mother broke the silence. Her wail, rising to a shriek of anguish, was that of a banshee as she hurled herself from their caravan home, crashed down the wooden steps, came reeling after her son, her arms outstretched. But she did not go to him. Instead, she fell to her knees some paces away, her arms still reaching, aching for him. For the chief of this band, their king, had stepped forward to embrace the young man. He hugged him, kissed him on both cheeks, released him, and without more ado, the chosen one went out of the firelight between the wagons and was swallowed by darkness. Dumitru! His mother screamed. She got to her feet, made to rush after him, and flew into the arms of her king. Peace, woman, he told her gruffly, his throat bobbing. We've seen it coming a month now. Watch the change in him. The old one has called and Dumitru answers. We knew what to expect. This is always the way of it. But he's my son, she sobbed rackingly into his chest. Aye, he said, his own voice finally breaking, sending tears coursing down his leathery cheeks. And mine too. Aye. He led her stumbling and sobbing back to their caravan, and behind them the music started up again, and the dancing, and the feasting, and drinking. Dumitru Zira climbed the ramparts of the Zarundului like a fox born to those heights. The moon lit a path for him, but even without that silver swath, he would have known the way. For there was guidance from within. A voice inside his head, which was not his voice, told him where to step, reach, grasp. There were paths up here if you knew them, but between these hairpin tracks were vertiginous shortcuts. Dumitru chose the latter, or someone made that choice for him. Dumitru, the dark voice crooned to him, drawing out his name like a cry of torment. Ah, my faithful, my Skani, son of my sons, step here and there, and here, Dumitru, and here where the wolf stepped. See his mark on the rock. The father of your fathers awaits you, Dumitru. The moon has risen up, and the hour draws nigh. Make haste, my son, for I'm old and dry and shriveled close to death, the true death. But you shall succor me, Dumitru. I and all your youth and strength be min. Almost to the tree line the youth labored, his breath ragged and his hands bloody from the climbing, to the blackest crags of all, where a vast ruin humped against the final cliff. On the one side a gorge so sheer and black it might descend to hell, and on the other the last of the tall firs shielding the tumbled piles of some ancient keep, set back against sheer rising walls of rock. Dumitru saw the place and for a moment was brought up short. But then he also saw the flame-eyed wolf standing in the broken gates of the ruin and hesitated no more. He went on and the great wolf led the way. Welcome to my house, Dumitru. That glutinous voice oozed like mud in his mind. You are my guest, my son. Enter of your own free will. Dumitru Zira clambered dazedly over the first shattered stones of the place, and mazed as he was still, the queer aspect of these ruins impressed him. It had been a castle, of that he was sure. In olden times a boyar had lived here, a Ferenczy, Janos Ferenczy. No question of that, for down all the ages since the time of Grigor Zira, the first Skani king, the Ziras had sworn allegiance to the Baron Ferenczy and had borne his crest. A bat leaping into flight from the mouth of a black urn, with wings outspread, showing 3 ribs to each wing. The eyes of the bat were red, likewise the ribs of its wings made prominent in scarlet, while the vessel from which it soared was in the shape of a burial urn. Aye, and now the youth's deep sunken, staring eyes picked out a like design carved on the shattered slab of a huge stone lintel, where it lay half buried in debris. And indeed, he knew that he stood upon the threshold of the great and ancient patron of the Ziras and their followers. For it was that same sigil as described, which even now was displayed on the sides of Vasily Zira's caravan, however cleverly obscured in the generally ornate and much convoluted lacquer and paintwork designs. Similarly, old Vasil, Dumitru's father, wore a ring bearing a miniature of this crest, allegedly passed down to him from time immemorial. This would have been Dumitru's one day, had he not heard the calling. Some little way ahead of Dumitru, the great wolf growled low in its throat, urging him on. He paused, however, uncertain where the shadows of fallen blocks obscured his vision. The front edge of the ruin seemed to have been tossed, yes, as by some enormous explosion in the guts of the place, out to and beyond the rim of the gorge, where still a jumble of massive stones and slates were spread in a dark confusion, so that Dumitru supposed a large part of the castle had gone down into the gorge. As to what could have caused such destruction, he had no, "But you hesitate, my son," came that monstrous mental voice, oozing like a slug in his mind, overriding and obliterating all matters of question and conjecture and will. That voice which had completely overwhelmed and taken control of him, during the course of the last 4 or 5 weeks, making him its zombie. And one see that it is as I suspected, Dumea true. You are strong-willed. Good! Very good. The strength of the will is that of the body, and the strength of the body is the blood. Your blood is strong, my son, as it is in all your race. The great wolf growled again, and Dumatru stumbled after. The youth knew he should flee this place, run headlong, break his bones in the dark, and crawl if he must. Anything but carry on. And yet he was powerless against the lure of that ancient evil voice. It was as if he had made some promise he could not break, or as if he kept the promise of some long-dead and honored ancestor, which was inviolable.